There is a moment in every great love story when the curtain finally falls. Not with dramatic music or sweeping orchestration, but in silence, in the quiet signing of a legal document, in the hollow echo of an empty house that once held 19 years of a life built together. That moment came for Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban in the summer of 2025. And when it did, the world had more questions than answers. How does a marriage that survived addiction, distance, and the crushing weight of superstardom simply end? How does a man who once credited his wife with saving his very soul end up watching her walk away? For months, no one spoke. Not Nicole, not Keith, not the army of handlers, publicists, and close friends who had witnessed the rise and fall of one of Hollywood's most celebrated unions. And then, quietly, Russell Crowe began to talk. What he revealed didn't just explain the end of marriage. It rewrote everything the world thought it knew about it. To understand why Russell Crowe's words carry the weight they do, you have to understand the relationship that earned him the right to speak them. This is not a man who gossips. He is not a celebrity who trades whispers at industry parties or drops hints to tabloid journalists looking for a headline. In 4 decades of being one of the most recognizable faces on the planet, Russell Crowe has maintained a fiercely guarded wall around his personal relationships. He is the kind of friend you call at 2 in the morning when everything has fallen apart, and he answers. And he never tells a soul what you said. That is the man who knew Nicole Kidman's secret long before the rest of the world had any idea a secret existed. Their bond did not form in the artificial warmth of a studio lot or on the polished marble floor of a film premiere. It was forged in the late 1980s in the raw, hungry world of the Australian entertainment industry, where 2 young performers with enormous ambition and zero guarantee of success found in each other a kind of kinship that only people chasing the same impossible dream can understand. They were not yet icons. They were not yet household names. They were 2 Australians who saw in each other the same fire and the same fear, and that connection became the bedrock of a friendship that would outlast marriages, continents, and decades of extraordinary change. He watched her fall in love with Tom Cruise. He was there, quietly, when that love collapsed in one of the most publicly discussed divorces the entertainment world had ever witnessed. He saw what it cost her. He saw what she salvaged from the wreckage. And he was present in January of 2005 at a glittering Los Angeles gala when a woman who had rebuilt herself from the inside out walked into a room and had her life changed by a man she had never met before. Keith Urban did not make an earth-shattering first impression. That is perhaps what made the eventual impact so powerful. Nicole would later laugh, recalling that she had assumed he hadn't even noticed her that night. For 4 months, she heard nothing. 4 months of silence from a man who, by all accounts, had noticed her very much but was working up the courage to act on it. When he finally called, the 2 of them did not ease into romance gently. They fell into it the way people fall off cliffs, all at once, and with no possibility of stopping. A motorcycle ride through the winding beauty of Woodstock. A secluded picnic under open sky. Nicole Kidman, a woman who had spent years being photographed and studied and consumed by the public, later said that was the moment she was gone. Completely, irreversibly gone. By June of 2006, barely 18 months after that first meeting, they were married. 2 Australians who had made the whole world their stage, standing in front of their closest friends and promising each other forever. What the public saw that day was a fairy tale. 2 of the most glamorous people on earth choosing each other in front of a world that had been rooting for both of them. What only a small handful of people understood was that Nicole Kidman was not simply marrying a man she had fallen in love with. She was making a choice to love a man who came with a history. A man who had battled his own interior darkness for years. A man who inspired in her something she had perhaps not felt since she was young enough to believe that love alone could be sufficient armor against the world. Russell Crowe, standing somewhere in the warm periphery of that celebration, understood both the beauty and the risk. He had known Nicole long enough to understand that when she loved with everything. And he knew that everything offered to the wrong person at the wrong moment was an extraordinary amount to lose. And then, for months later, forever almost ended before it had truly begun. Keith Urban's battle with addiction was not a secret he had managed to fully conquer before walking down the aisle. It was a demon he had learned to live beside, and in the early days of his marriage, that demon returned with devastating force. He checked himself into rehabilitation in October of 2006, and he would later speak about it with the kind of brutal honesty that demands respect. He said plainly that he had caused the implosion of his brand-new marriage. Not the distance, not the pressure of fame. Him, his choices, his failure to do the necessary work before standing at that altar. Russell Crowe watched from the sidelines as Nicole Kidman faced the first and most defining test of her marriage. She could have walked away. No one would have blamed her. They had barely unpacked their wedding gifts. Instead, she dismantled her entire professional life and stood beside him. Film commitments disappeared. Press obligations vanished. For the duration of his recovery, Nicole Kidman existed only as his wife, his anchor, his reason to fight. She did it not out of weakness or obligation, but out of a profound, clear-eyed love that understood something most people in her position would not have had the generosity to understand. She could not save him. Only he could save himself. Her job was simply to refuse to leave while he did. He did. Against every reasonable expectation, Keith Urban emerged from that period a different man. Or so it seemed. He spoke in interviews about being reborn into Nicole's love. He described her as his anchor to everything good and real in his life. And for years, the world watched and believed him, because the evidence appeared to support it. They were photographed at airports reuniting after separations with a visible, uninhibited joy that felt almost too genuine to be performed. Their public appearances had the quality of two people who genuinely could not wait to be in the same room again. Russell Crowe watched all of this too, and he believed it. He had reason to. He had seen Nicole at her most vulnerable and Keith at his most broken, and he had watched them choose each other through both. When a couple survives what they survived in those early months, you believe they're capable of surviving anything. What neither Crowe nor anyone else foresaw was that the greatest threat to their marriage would not arrive with the ferocity of crisis. It would creep in through the calendar. One missed anniversary. One canceled holiday. One 3 a.m. phone call from a different city in a different time zone. Keith Urban's career ran on the road. Approximately 200 days every year, he was somewhere else. Different stage, different city, different country. The economics of country music superstardom demanded, and Keith had built his career on that engine. For the first several years of their marriage, Nicole and Keith appeared to navigate this reality with an admirable discipline. Love letters sent every night. Video calls scheduled across time zones. Surprise visits that made for beautiful fan photographs and even more beautiful private memories. But somewhere in the middle of the second decade of their marriage, something shifted. It did not happen overnight. It happened the way erosion happens, so gradually that by the time you notice the damage, the ground has already given way. Keith himself once described the reality of life on a tour bus with a rawness that should have served as a warning. He talked about waking at 3 in the morning in a moving vehicle, sick and exhausted, missing his family, profoundly lonely. He was describing the conditions that make people vulnerable, the conditions that make voids. And voids, as Russell Crowe would later observe, are extraordinarily dangerous things. The behavioral changes arrived so quietly that Nicole spent months convincing herself she was imagining them. A phone placed face down on a dinner table. A sharp, defensive response to a simple question about his day. Vague answers where once there had been specific, enthusiastic detail. These were small things. Individually, each one was explainable. Together, they formed a pattern that her intelligence and her instincts refused to allow her to dismiss. Nicole Kidman is not a woman who has survived the scrutiny of a global spotlight for 30 years by being naive. She is perceptive, she is methodical, and she is not easily deceived. The growing unease she felt was not anxiety without cause. It was information. What confirmed it for Russell Crowe was what he witnessed in public. Keith's declarations of love, already warm and frequent, began to escalate in a way that struck those who knew him well as disproportionate. At a high-profile ceremony in April of 2024, he delivered a tribute to his wife that moved the audience to tears. He spoke about her choosing love in the darkest moment of their marriage. He invoked the language of salvation and gratitude and unwavering devotion. It was beautiful. It was also, to those who knew what was happening behind closed doors, deeply unsettling. Because there is a pattern recognized by every relationship counselor and every close observer of human behavior, in which a person performing extraordinary public devotion is simultaneously dismantling the private reality that devotion is supposed to represent. The louder the declaration, the larger the gap it is trying to cover. Crowe saw the gap. He had seen Nicole's face when she thought no one was watching. He had seen a woman in pain trying to make sense of what her own life was telling her. She had begun to do what intelligent people do when they cannot trust what they are being told directly. She looked for evidence in the margins, subtle inconsistencies in his accounts of his days, stories from people on the touring crew that did not quite align with what she had been told, social media photographs that seemed, at first glance, like ordinary fan interactions, but that, examined more closely, suggested a warmth and a familiarity that went beyond the professional. None of it was conclusive on its own. All of it together was damning. And then came the night that removed any remaining shadow of doubt. Russell Crowe has described being the person Nicole turned to in the aftermath. Not immediately, not that same night, but in the days that followed a discovery she had not been looking for and could not unsee. She had found messages on Keith's phone, not vague exchanges that require interpretation. Specific conversations with a woman who was part of his touring world. Conversations that described meetings arranged during windows of time when Keith had told Nicole he was working. The gap between the story she had been given and the reality those messages revealed was not a matter of degree. It was a chasm, and standing at the edge of it, Nicole Kidman understood that she was not dealing with a misunderstanding or a moment of weakness or a single terrible lapse in judgment. She was dealing with a calculated, sustained deception from the man whose life she had once reorganized her entire existence to protect. The cruelty of the timing should not go unacknowledged. Nicole was in the middle of a period of intense and emotionally demanding professional work. The kind of acting that requires a performer to leave themselves open, to access genuine feeling rather than simulated. She was already raw. She was already running on reserves. To discover what she discovered in that condition was not simply painful. It was a particular kind of devastating. The conversation between them, when it came, was not a screaming match. It was something worse. It was controlled. It was thorough. It lasted through the night and into the early hours of the morning, and throughout it, Nicole presented what she had found. Not just the messages, but the timeline they created, the expenses that suddenly made a different kind of sense, the stories that could now be understood in an entirely different light. She was not performing anger. She was conducting a reckoning. And when she had laid out every piece of it, she did not end the marriage that morning. She offered something that the man sitting across from her almost certainly did not deserve. She offered a final chance. Not an open-ended second chance. A final one. The conditions were explicit, non-negotiable, and unambiguous. Complete transparency going forward. A genuine and substantial reduction in touring. An immediate commitment to professional help for both of them. If he met those conditions, she would stay. If he broke them, she would not issue another warning. There would simply be consequences. Consider what that moment required of her. She was not an uncertain young woman navigating a new relationship. She was one of the most accomplished performers of her generation, a woman who had rebuilt herself after a very public first marriage collapse, who had spent 19 years choosing this man daily, who had sat in a rehab waiting room, so he would not have to face his worst hour alone. The composure she brought to that confrontation was not emotional distance. It was the most demanding kind of strength there is. The strength required to love someone clearly enough to hold them to account rather than simply absorbing what they had done and pretending it hadn't happened. She saw him, not the version of him he had been performing for the public, but the actual man sitting across from her at 4 in the morning with nowhere left to hide. And she offered him, one final time, the choice to be better, For a brief, fragile window of time in the early part of 2025, it appeared that he intended to take the offer seriously. There were gestures of recommitment. There were appearances that suggested to the outside world, and to Nicole's most cautious optimism, that they were finding their way back to each other. A vow renewal that sources described as intimate and sincere. Social media posts in June of 2025 that expressed love with what appeared to be genuine warmth. The public, who had no idea any of this was happening, saw a couple who seemed as devoted as ever. But the promises did not hold. By the summer, the pattern that Nicole had confronted in that long, sleepless night had returned. Nothing dramatic. Nothing she could have pointed to as a single defining act. But the energy that had briefly reappeared in their marriage, the presence, the accountability, the effort, quietly withdrew again. And Nicole Kidman, a woman who had defined the terms of a final warning clearly enough that there was no room for misinterpretation, acted on them. By August 29th of 2025, the divorce settlement had been signed. By September 30th, it was filed in Davidson County, Tennessee. The phrase used in the documents was the standard, sanitized one, irreconcilable differences. But the settlement itself, for those who knew how to read it, was far more revealing than any statement either party might have made. The custody arrangement told the most important part of the story. Keith Urban, who had spoken in hundreds of interviews about the centrality of fatherhood to his identity, accepted a custody arrangement that gave him access to his daughters for 59 days per year, 17% of a year. No father who believed he had the moral high ground in a divorce accepts 17% without a fight. Keith did not fight. The reason he did not fight is that fighting would have required opening the legal process to discovery, to documentation, to the exposure of the very things he had been working so hard to keep private. The silence was not grief. The silence was strategy. A man protecting himself from consequences he knew he had earned. The financial structure reinforced what the custody arrangement implied. Child support was paid not in the standard monthly installments that would have maintained an ongoing financial connection between two people who no longer wished to be connected. It was paid in a single lump sum, upfront, settled, and complete. It was not a gesture of generosity. It was the legal equivalent of cutting every remaining thread. A man with leverage in a divorce negotiation does not surrender all continuing financial accountability in one payment. A man without leverage accepts whatever terms allow him to close the chapter as quietly and as quickly as possible. Russell Crowe watched the false narrative begin to form the moment the news went public. The framing that emerged in the coverage, the idea of a touring musician's schedule creating an unfortunate distance and a wife who had eventually grown cold, was not just incomplete. It was a reversal of the truth. And Crowe, who had spent 20 years watching Nicole Kidman give more of herself to this marriage than most people in her position would have considered reasonable, found that he could not allow it to stand. His decision to speak was not impulsive. It was deliberate. He understood exactly what breaking the unwritten rule of celebrity loyalty would cost him in certain circles. He made the calculation anyway, because the alternative was watching his closest friend's character be misread by the public, while she was legally constrained from correcting the record herself. He was not spreading gossip. He was providing context. He was ensuring that the woman who had once canceled her professional life to stand in a rehab waiting room, who had offered a final chance when no one would have blamed her for not offering one, who had conducted herself through the most painful private experience of her adult life with a composure that the public was misreading as coldness. He was ensuring that woman was understood correctly. Nicole Kidman, in the weeks and months following the finalization of her divorce, did not perform grief for public consumption. She also did not perform recovery. She did not post carefully curated photographs of self-reinvention or release carefully worded statements about growth and new chapters. She showed up to work. She delivered performances. She protected her daughters. She moved through the world with the particular bearing of a person who has processed something enormous in private and has chosen to carry it with dignity rather than display it. There was no drama because she was not interested in drama. There was no public mudslinging because she was not interested in mud. She was interested in her children, her work, and the long, quiet business of rebuilding. People who observe her closely during this period noted something that was easy to mistake for detachment, but was actually something quite different. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a person has spent a very long time carrying uncertainty and has finally, at enormous cost, arrived at solid ground. The uncertainty of suspicion is its own particular torture. It sits beneath every ordinary moment and poisons it. The certainty of knowing, even when what you know is devastating, is at least a place to stand. Nicole Kidman was standing, firmly, quietly, and entirely on her own terms. What Russell Crowe ultimately revealed about Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban is not simply the anatomy of a failed marriage. It is something far more layered than that. It is the story of what happens when one person in a partnership brings their full self to the table across 2 decades. Their forgiveness, their patience, their strategic intelligence, their willingness to set ultimatums and mean them. And the other person, despite every opportunity, every second chance, every act of extraordinary grace offered to them, ultimately cannot or will not honor what was built together. Keith Urban is not a villain in the operatic sense. He is something more complicated and, in some ways, more difficult to reckon with. He is a man who experienced genuine love, who spoke about it with what appeared to be genuine feeling, who was saved by it and said so openly and repeatedly, and who still could not sustain the fidelity that love required of him. Whether that reflects a fundamental incapacity or a failure of will is a question only he can answer. What is not a question is what it cost the woman who loved him. Nicole Kidman gave this marriage everything available to her. She gave it patience when patience was unreasonable. She gave it forgiveness when forgiveness was unprecedented. She gave it one last chance when she had already been handed more than sufficient reason to walk away long before the final warning was ever issued. And when the final warning was broken and she made the decision to end it, she did so not with the chaotic grief of someone who had been blindsided, but with the measured, purposeful action of a woman who had seen this possibility clearly and had already quietly prepared for it. The legacy of their marriage will be told differently by different people. Keith Urban will tell it, if he ever tells it publicly, as the story of a touring life that slowly eroded something that was once real. The tabloids will tell it as the story of a beautiful fairy tale that simply ran its course. But Russell Crowe, the man who was present at the beginning and the end, who stood in both the joy and the wreckage, has offered a different account. One that is not about a love that faded. One that is about a trust that was broken, repaired imperfectly, broken again, and finally irrevocably destroyed. And Nicole Kidman, who has spent 30 years being one of the most observed women on the planet, carries none of this visibly. She carries it the way all great things are carried, inward, quietly, without making a show of the weight. The Queen, as someone close to her once said, does not explain herself to the court. She simply continues to reign. That is exactly what she is doing. And that, in the end, is the truth that Russell Crowe wanted the world to know. Not because it is a comfortable truth. Not because it makes the ending of their story any less painful to witness. But because it is the accurate one. In a world that moves fast and forgets faster, where narratives harden into myth within days of being first published, the difference between the story that is told and the story that actually happened matters enormously, especially when the person at the center of it is not in a position to correct the record herself. Russell Crowe gave that correction, quietly, deliberately, with a full understanding of what it would cost him in a world that rewards silence and punishes disclosure. He did it because 19 years of watching Nicole Kidman be extraordinary had earned her, at minimum, the truth being told accurately. And because some friendships, the real ones, the ones built before the fame and the money and the global recognition arrive to complicate everything, operate by a different set of rules entirely. You protect your friend, even when protecting them requires you to say aloud the things everyone else has agreed to leave unspoken.